Welcome to Natural Recovery from Suffering. This is Scott Killaby. So I want to, first of all, talk to anybody who's listening who grew up sensitive. Whether you wore that on your sleeve or you hid that part of yourself, I want to talk to you and that part of you because I've discovered something that you're going to want to know. Maybe, unless you're scared of it. But I'm just going to tell it in the form of my story so it doesn't feel offensive to you because I want you to hear this, and I know how sensitivity is. And, well, I'll speak for myself. Being a sensitive person, I always wanted people just to speak for themselves. And it's funny that I'm a teacher who teaches people. Well, because I've gotten over a lot of that hypersensitivity. But I know how it feels to be sensitive. I grew up that way. I fit this mold to a T. I was also creative. I was a young gay kid, and that's often the case. You'll see gay kids or who are sensitive. I think it has a lot to do with trauma, which I'll explain. But really, sensitivity is in all kinds of kids, and one could even argue we all have it. But my particular kind of sensitivity with buried anger showed up a certain way, and I want to talk about that because I think a lot of people in spirituality have this sort of, well, let me just describe it as energy. We are not the kind of people that get angry. If we're in a group, you're not going to see that from us, probably ever, or anything that seriously rocks the boat in that group. But we're the kind of person who's going to be monitoring everybody in that group in different ways. And so we might appear as a good listener, and maybe we are, maybe we aren't. And someone at times who's really attuned to people. Understanding that a big part of that had to do with, for me, trauma and monitoring people, which I'll get to. But that's the kind of sensitivity I'm talking about first. If that's you, you're the anger repressor. You may not know that you're an anger repressor, but look at the other characteristics of this. Of being highly sensitive, easily triggerable. When triggers happen, stuff is taken pretty personally. Can't get angry, so triggers can last a while. Disconnect from people a lot. Find yourself alone or with one person, not loving groups at all. And it's closely associated with introversion, but it's different. I was highly creative. Maybe you are. There are these other characteristics with it that people talk about. I think the creativity for me was an outlet because I couldn't feel and express what was true. And I had to protect myself from other people's energy, I thought. So creativity was a natural outlet for me. But when my dad would raise his voice, I would cower or freeze. And that's what I mean by anger repression and sensitivity. And you might not have thought of it that way, perhaps, until this work or till you started reading about emotional repression. To me, that's the first category. Now, there are people who are like hurt repressors who will grow up and they'll tell you they're very sensitive. But it shows up differently for them sometimes than the rest of us. And there are people who repress all emotions and their sensitivity shows up. I think this is mostly trauma and repression when you get right down to it, because of how the sensitivity shows up differently for different repressions. But I digress. Let me go back to my story. Then I'll go to Chester's story, which will illustrate that difference. My story is, again, pulling away from people, not liking groups, sensitive to criticism, ridicule, sensitive to angry people, sensitive to people who have big energy, because as an empathic, sensitive, anger repressing kid, I had to pay attention to the people with the big energy because they were more likely to go into anger. The people with the smaller, more peaceful, kinder energy were always safer. And so there's the monitoring, is to see energetically, who are you? How do you show up? And then I would decide how I would show up based on what I would read in you. And then be something false. That's another thing about being sensitive. we tend to have deficiency stories, self-limiting beliefs that keep us safe from the buried anger or the buried hurt. This hyper monitoring of other people's energy, well, that protected me. When I was a little gay kid, I didn't have a word for it, but that energy of being gay was there. And with that repression, there had to be a monitoring of other people to see how that part, I had to hide that part. So the monitoring came straight from it. The looking at people to make sure it's safe, to do this, they do that, say this, say that. And the gender issue of being both male, female, inside, that part had to monitor masculine energy mostly to see what kind of masculine energy are you. Are you the kind of masculine energy that is dominating and very unconscious, which wouldn't understand or welcome me? Or is your energy different? Are you the kind of masculinity that might be more like an anger repressor and less threatening? So my sensitivity was tuned into repression from an early age, but I didn't have words for it. The big energy people and the angry people were suspect and had to be monitored. And then the more peaceful people, kinder, the anger repressors, they were safer. But everybody's scary when you have anger repression to some degree, because it's self-protection. You know, it's not even about other people. It's about, I can't feel and express this anger or other repression. I didn't know any of this growing up, so just like with all repression at the surface level, I saw what I saw. I saw my sensitivity, my triggerability, my quietness, my capacity to be a good listener, to attune to people's emotions, even anger, but then to take action with anger. So that's all and much more part of the profile of me as a sensitive person. As I grew up, though, the sensitivity, whereas it did protect me when I was a kid, it continued to protect me, obviously, but it became more of a burden because as an attorney, it got in the way of things. It's like what people would say, well, you didn't have a hard enough shell. So I became a mediator because that was better for my sensitivity to help people negotiate. I was simply really against true conflict and was very sensitive to that, even in my work life. And it showed. So repression drives things. I became a mediator instead of a litigator. Litigators are the ones who are fighting in court. I did fight in court, but it just, in the end, became more comfortable to mediate and do transactional work like wills, business contracts. So suffice it to say that this part of me was like, to me, a necessary but burdensome part of me because it felt very associated with my suffering, the sensitivity did. But I also knew that it protected me. And it was also associated with my creativity. I knew that for some reason my creativity was associated. I now know that creativity was an outlet for what I couldn't feel and express in relationship. And that what I had to be really sensitive to certain things, but then expression is held back. Creativity came forth almost like a trauma response for me. But those are just words. It's just what happened because I needed to express myself. But being a sensitive person, I often did not express myself in relationship. Not authentically. So when I look at all these things that I buried, my femininity, homosexuality, anger, in order to survive, and then when I see quite clearly that my sensitivity was coming directly from that repression, that's, of course, changes now my view of sensitivity or highly sensitive people or empaths and of myself. So people ask, what's it like before and after repression work? Let me talk about this issue of sensitivity. If you can see how my sensitivity was self-protective coming from anger repression and other repression, then as I did that work, something started to change. Anger started coming online, and I recognized that a lot of my triggerability, the triggerability of my sensitivity was actually anger repression. It was one of the first insights that I had, is that even though the triggers were kind of few and far between, when they would come, it would be from that same sort of sensitivity that always got triggered, and a very similar trigger, like a core thing from childhood. So it really showed me that with regard to triggers, so associated with my sensitivity. And then when I did anger repression work, I saw that the repression created the trigger for self-protection. It's safer to believe I'm unlovable in a trigger than it is to feel and express anger to my loved ones. So the sensitivity is to ward off ever having to do that, which may include identifying with a self-limiting belief or something. So I saw that. And that was an insight, and an insight it can't be taken away because you see into something. So I saw my triggerability was closely associated with my sensitivity, which was my anger repression in those moments. And then the triggers just left with anger repression work because I could feel and express what was true more and more. But with the triggers gone, I started to experience the end of that sensitivity that came from emotional repression in relationship. And I started to respond differently. That's what it was. In other words, in other moments where I would have stayed quiet and monitored other people and their anger, I was getting angry at times. I was being myself. I didn't have time to sit and monitor other people's emotions. I had things to say as I was doing this work. And when a former empath or an empath starts to say things that they've never said before, they don't have to use, or I didn't have to use, the sensitivity for self-protection in the same way. It was a natural thing. I didn't make a conscious decision not to be so triggerable or sensitive in relationship. It's just that I started to be more authentic, and my authentic self isn't just this sensitive, quiet kid. So all that wasn't me, is what I'm saying when I talk about it from an awakening standpoint. I have sensitivity. It's not me. I've had buried anger. I can feel and express anger. That's not me. But I was basing my entire persona on this buried anger and what I had to do to keep it down. Be really sensitive at the surface to ward off anything that might bring that up. My sensitivity in relationship was so closely associated with anger and other repression that I can't even think of it a different way now, because I don't show up the same way. Does that mean I'm not sensitive? Here's how it's become for me. So when you're authentic, or when I've experienced authenticity, it frees me up to actually be sensitive towards other people's emotions instead of self-protective. To be actually sensitive to their emotions. Does that make sense? Because when you have repression, you're sensitive to their emotions to protect yourself. But when that gets cleared, no, you can just be sensitive to their emotions, but you're also sensitive to your own. Maybe even first, we'll say it that way, that when we come out of repression, the first thing is, can I feel and express what's true for me before I monitor you to make sure it's okay to be me? Oh, come on. Let me be more honest even. Hell hath no fury for an anger repressor coming out of anger repression. Please. Have y'all done anger repression work? Then you know what I'm talking about. You found it. It's this ferocious thing that you're so glad you found, because now you can end suffering. But it's a lot, and it's all unconscious. And yeah, I think you guys know what I mean about the sensitivity being connected to that, right? The anger repressors doing this work, I find like they're going to be an easy audience for this one. I think it's the rest of the folks listening who might have challenges with this. But this is my direct experience, and I don't expect you to believe it. It's more just let me share this and see if it resonates. But the changes happen so directly proportionally. In other words, the hypersensitivity left in proportion to the anger repression being cleared and femininity repression. Y'all, to the simplest way is I was monitoring you to make sure I was okay. I had to be sensitive. That was a necessity. That was a survival or trauma response. I think we all have what we're calling sensitivity, but some of us have to use it. We have to hone that skill and dial that up like it's a pair of antennas that you don't see. And we're watching you and feeling you for survival. But if we don't have to watch and feel you for survival, if we clear emotional repression from the body, then sensitivity is used for the purpose of, when I see it that way and say it that way, it's really beautiful actually. To actually be sensitive to someone else's emotions without having to be scared. Including anger. I have to throw that one in there because we're talking about anger. Well, for now, we're talking about anger repression and being empathic. So I had to be able to get angry at people to shift the focus off of monitoring them and whether they're going to get angry, and instead just being myself. So simple. Let's see, the sensitivity was used by the false self for safety. You could say it that way. But when that's not happening, then sensitivity is not used for safety, except for, well, of course, if I'm walking through a dark alley and I sense somebody and their energy, that's still going to be there and helpful. But I don't have to do that with the people that I love. They're safe. I mean, if they're not, why am I with them? But the people that I've decided and agreed to and have been opening to, I want something more than just monitoring your emotions for safety. I want something more than suffering and sensitivity to triggers. And that's what I have now. I'm very happy about that, actually, that I have that. And this is why I can do this podcast episode, to tell you what, for me, that transformation is like. I'm just not afraid of people, is one way of saying it. I was always afraid of people. I thought. I wasn't really. I was afraid of my own anger. I was sensitive to that. Had to monitor that energy within myself, probably more than anybody else. Monitoring other people. I have a bit of a cold, and I've been doing some podcasts recently, guys, so hopefully my throat will last as long as my interest in this. I had to get angry at people to stop monitoring their emotions. That's one way of saying it. I had to at some point get angry at myself to clear up relationship because I wouldn't always express things clearly. And then there might be some trigger later and I would realize, well, I didn't express something clearly. And I would have to experience being angry at myself. Again, that was just part of not having to monitor your anger and showing up more authentically and expressing more. Needs, wants, boundaries, and eliminating suffering. And being free, energetically free because of doing the anger repression work. Like really feeling that. Not just reporting a different way of being, but a different way of being. Just energetically. Not from the mind. I don't think I know anything more than I knew. Or maybe I know a lot less. But I've seen that I don't have to hold back anger and monitor you. And that wasn't allowing you to be you. And so a sensitive person often doesn't realize that in the monitoring, we can't have the depthful relationships that we want because we have to monitor people's energy and we rob them and us of getting to know them. If our sensitivity is tuned in to people who are angry, I don't know about you, but I cut those people off. I cut the bully off wherever I saw him before he became a bully or she. There's the sensitivity in action. So that would be like being in a group or something, and there's some energy over here I don't like. And so I find my way of like disconnecting from those people in the group and being more connected to the safer people. So then I don't get to have a relationship with these other people. I never had a romantic relationship with someone who could get angry, as I've told you, until Chester. So look for that with your sensitivity. If it's based in anger repression, you don't have a lot of people around you who get angry. But see, that's robbing you of your own authenticity to protect yourself like that. It may not seem that way at first because it looks like you're maybe scared of other people, but you're scared of yourself if you have anger repression. So when I say I'm no longer scared of people, it just means I'm not scared of myself. The emotions don't scare me. And if they do, I know how to process. And so therefore, sensitivity is used in a completely different way. If I can't be sensitive first to how I feel, I can't be authentic. I can't be in a relationship and really show up. If I can't be sensitive first to everything that I'm feeling and not just use my sensitivity to protect myself from feeling something, namely anger. So as soon as you do the repression work or get through a bit of it, you'll see that your sensitivity doesn't have to be used as a shield or a weapon in the same way. It can be used as an instrument to help deepen relationships, and authenticity. I want to give examples because it sounds so theoretical. If I'm easily triggerable as someone who's sensitive because I have anger repression, then when the trigger happens, I'm going to be self-protective so I don't feel and express the anger. Therefore, the whole conversation or whatever is going to be somewhat focused on making sure you don't get angry. And that there just can't be authenticity. And so the sensitivity is used to I might need to shut down here or go away at any point in time if you raise your energy level to a certain place. But it's really unconscious. It might just show up as someone who is very sensitive in a conversation and maybe even defensive, but not angry if it's anger repression. But see how it changed for me? The transformation was this. It's that by being able to feel and express my own anger, I didn't have to monitor the other person during these conversations, these adult conversations. So by not monitoring their emotions, they could just be themselves more. And then I could be sensitive to their actual emotions, not using sensitivity to make sure they don't feel and express some of those, but to be sensitive to them because it's okay that they do, because it's okay if I do. That's what we call we space, and it's highly transformative for somebody with sensitivity to do we space inquiry, to see how much the anger repression is driving that sensitivity. Highly transformative because you can finally listen. The thing about repression work is you can finally be there. You don't have to disconnect. You can listen. You can be sensitive to someone else's. But the difference is I don't just go along with everything. Okay, that's so important. Because for me, sensitivity meant I'm just going to sit here and shake my head and be really loving. Yeah, right. I mean, it's all coming from anger repression. If I can't be real, but that's how I used to do it. Like being really sensitive. I'm monitoring your emotions is what I'm doing the whole time. But I can't be real. It's so loving to be able to get angry at someone, because then you can be real, and then the sensitivity isn't self-protective. You can have real conversations that are messy, of course, at times, because no longer self-protecting in the same way. But the sensitivity, when you do anger repression work, it doesn't, you're no longer as self-protective. So you can open up. That's all that I'm saying. And what's been so beautiful is I got to open up to somebody who is an archetype that would have fallen into the category of angry person, Chester, or even bully at times when he would get really angry, which was my trauma. To be, this was perfect relationship for me, someone who was very sensitive because he was bullied in part, and then to be with someone who can get angry like that. I had to be authentic or suffer, basically. When somebody can get really angry at you, if you let someone like that in your life, not all the time, but from time to time, if you don't do anger repression work, that can go badly. And conversations can go badly where people do not hear each other. But when the anger repressor does anger repression work, the triggerability goes down. The self-defensiveness around anger repression goes down. In other words, just the defensiveness as a whole goes down. But what comes forth is authenticity. So the anger repressor gets to be angry around certain things and defend themselves. It's not the same defensiveness, though, coming from hypersensitivity and emotional repression. It's an authenticity that can look like self-defense in a moment, but it's just someone finally speaking up for themselves. Finally, not just being quiet and sensitive in the corner or in the relationship. That's what it is. That's the shift for anger repressors. When you no longer have to be quiet if that's your thing. You don't have to quietly monitor other people. You can be yourself and then really open to other people, including angry people. So what I learned about Chester, and this is beautiful, I remember laying in bed with him one night, and he was being he doesn't get angry. He realized, from time to time he does, he realized it, and he said that this night in bed. He said, when I was a kid, I was so starved of love and attention, he said. Make you cry. That I would get angry at my dad because I knew that somewhere down the line, we would resolve it and I would get to feel his attention for a little bit. Oh man, when I heard that, talk about sensitivity, I could really hear that. Because we had already opened to each other and being able to feel and express anger, he felt safe to open to me in his vulnerability. And I could really hear that. And I saw that earlier fights that we had, me and Chester, that he was seeing Dad on my face. And I reminded him that I do pay attention and love him. But that's not enough. He had to see it to stop being angry with me. He had to see that I loved him and that I was paying attention. And I could only really pay attention in the way that's healthy for me after and during anger repression inquiry, because the attention before that was self-protective and, frankly, pretty sensitive. So I couldn't open to him, couldn't hear those kinds of things. He couldn't share those kinds of things. But once my sensitivity wasn't hooked into the anger repression, here it came. And I said to him that night, even though other people might think that or see you as however they see you, especially if you get angry, He has the big energy too. I said, Chester, you're very sensitive. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. And he said, yes, I am. And I could just see him, you know? And he knew I could see him. That also taught me something about being empathic or sensitive, because he grew up as a kid who didn't look sensitive on the outside. He was not like me on the outside. That's why I was attracted to him. He has that more big exterior, which doesn't come off as quiet and reserved or hypersensitive or anything like that on the outside. But of course, once I saw what was going on within him, I knew better. But I understood that sensitivity is probably within we all have this. But some of us, or like him, maybe sensitivity was too close to the vulnerable emotions, too close to love, and he was starved of that. So he had to starve his own sensitivity and not let anybody see it. Is that you? Maybe that's you if you're a hurt or sadness repressor that had to have an exterior that just couldn't be sensitive. Whereas some anger repressors, well, we may have that too, but we may wear sensitivity on our sleeve a little bit more, maybe a lot more. Because it's like part of our persona. Like, we're good, we're peaceful, don't do anything, you know? Don't get too angry. Since then, I've done a lot of work with, well, not since then, since developing repression inquiry, I have done a lot of sitting with people, not just my partner, who were hurt and sadness repressors, who were labeled as angry and sometimes insensitive when they were growing up. It's not true about them. Everyone that I worked with in some way repressed vulnerable emotions and had to hide that sensitivity, but it was there. Thank God, because we need that sensitivity to reverse emotional repression. Think of something like buried hurt or sadness and how we have to deny our own sensitivity to those emotions to survive. So as we rediscover those buried emotions, there's a gentle, loving curiosity towards that. But at the same time, there's a violent resistance to feeling that hurt or sadness. So it's not my repression, but I watch people go through it, and it's a beautiful process. I see people so differently now. People just don't scare me. I mean, the world looks so different now. The people who are scarier are the anger repressors, like me. But I'm not scared of them either. It's just that the covert nature of that is tricky. With someone who can express anger, as somebody who grew up sensitive, you kind of know what you get with anger. If you come out of anger repression, you just see, well, some people are angry on the surface because they're hurt and afraid at the core. It's easier to be with them at first. When you're an anger repressor and you're coming out of anger repression, you see so many things about yourself that you don't like the hypersensitivity. And until you do your deeper work, you might have shadows towards other anger repressors. I did, and most everybody does. But it's just part of it. And we don't need to be against each other, but only for a while as we come out of our repression. It's a natural part of it. It'll show up like this. As you do anger repression work, when you see people being really unconsciously empathic or even identified with it, you're going to see right through it. You're not going to buy it in the same way because you've done your work, and you're going to see, well, that's the person self-protecting, just like I was. You're probably going to have to deal with a shadow, though, like I did. Because I kept seeing people with anger repression come into groups and appear very sensitive, but what I saw is triggerability, mostly, from repression. So that, because they weren't looking at it and they were self-protecting and getting upset, so to speak, at the angry people, is like, God, do you see what you're doing? My gosh, that's so controlling. But when we have anger repression, we can't see it. We just think we're being a peaceful agent in a group. We don't see the control behind it. That our sensitivity is very much driven by an intense terror at the core. We have to be honest about this. That a lot of that sensitivity is driven by just pure fear. Because if we don't acknowledge that, then repression has a way of just continuing to control life. So here in spirituality, there's a kind of covert thing going on, as I've been saying. And sensitivity gets sometimes held in, to an exalted place. Like if you're sensitive, you're special, or you have this special gift. You can read people before they even know where they're going. And even as a teacher, that being able to read people's energy was helpful to guide them, because, being empathic is helpful. But spirituality is like this trauma shelter for so many people. And we're using these things that are basically trauma as spiritual identities or safe trauma shelters. Like staying identified or being identified with being an empath. At some point, that's got to go, because that could be protecting you, again, from repression. It doesn't have to go, but if you can't see it as part of your suffering instead of just something that you're proud of, or I don't think it's about being proud or not proud of it. It's just about owning it and seeing where it's coming from, and not just assuming that what you see at the visible surface is what you are. Because if we assume that, then we think that Chester's just a big asshole and I'm just a quiet, very sensitive, always loving person. It's not real. Our authenticity replaces our oversensitivity. Once we can feel and express what's true, our attention is not focused on holding back and monitoring others. To me, it's that simple. It doesn't matter what you repress. You don't have to monitor other people anymore. You may even get to a place where you don't care what other people think, but it's not negative. It's just you're no longer turning your sensitivity on their emotions and what they're thinking, and instead just feeling and expressing what's true for you. What empaths or sensitive people don't realize is they have just this tremendous potential that is unrealized because the fear of being themselves isn't being thought out, potentially. If you're using the empath identity or sensitive identity in any way to protect yourself, you probably have frozen fear. You probably have a sense of separation. You may have a victim identity. Deficiency stories. These are all the signs of it. But I guess I just want to say in my last words here, to people in spirituality around sensitivity, I saw an interview by Oprah of Prince, who was not called Prince at that time. He was the symbol for the male and female. I can't know for sure that Prince was an anger repressor. He had to repress the feminine, obviously, because that's why he changed his name. When he was interviewed by her, a couple of things came up for me. When she would ask him questions, his voice was so light, he could barely speak. He was very shy and self-conscious. It reminded me a lot of my own self-consciousness earlier in life, where I couldn't answer questions or speak in a way that was confident. But so he was an artist, though, so he gets a pass. It's like, oh, this is just the artist type. A pass means, where's that coming from? I had to look at where that came from, because I couldn't be Prince. Even though I was writing songs, I didn't get to be a famous, where you can just be this sensitive, sort of eccentric artist. I had to go get a job and fake it and pretend until it just got the best of me. really my anger repression, and then I came to spirituality to get healthy eventually from that. When I look at him, I think, in that state, you can be an artist, but it's hard to live like that out in the world as somebody who's really self-conscious and sensitive. But see, just like him, if you never surround yourself with people who get angry, and it's just like him being someone who I assume could have the people around him that he wanted, I had the life. Everybody with repression in some way or another creates the life and the relationships that keep them safe. So in some ways, we're never tested because of our repression. We don't have those people around us who would push our buttons enough where we stay with them in those challenging relationships and actually discover who we really are. In other words, we tend to create a life that I think maybe Prince had, where, and I had, where you have yes people around you. You're very self-conscious. People even coddling you to a certain degree. It's very difficult to transform in that. Unless you're really earnest, it is, because, well, think about it. Who would you turn to in that to really get your buttons pushed? And that's what very sensitive people need, is to take that trigger ability and bring the process to anger repression, if it's anger repression, and watch that self-consciousness change just to consciousness. Just being conscious instead of conscious of a self that you have to monitor in your own emotions and others. See, that self-consciousness is that same. That's why I love non-duality, because the self-consciousness right there is quite literally what the issue is. When you're really sensitive, you have to be conscious. You have to make up a self here and monitor those emotions and thoughts. But when you're just conscious from doing repression inquiry and presence, all that energy is free. All the energy that previously monitored is free. Imagine it for a moment. Just feel how open that might feel. Where you're in the room with somebody, and it doesn't matter now whether they're a yes person or a no person. I actually like surrounding myself with some no people who will disagree with me. It's just really healthy, and I discovered who I really am through the full array or full gamut of, or opposites of relationship, like not just yes people, And it was the people who would disagree with me and bring up that hyper triggerability from anger repression that were my best teachers. Because a lot of them were people who didn't appear sensitive on the outside. So they were an easy target for me. Where's your sensitivity? Maybe they were angry. And it's just easy to make them into a shadow. But when you can't do that anymore, you just open to people. You don't turn them into a shadow, And so definitely have learned a lot, or even more, from the people in my life that were sensitive, but they really had to hide it, as opposed to me, as I use it as a shield and sometimes a weapon. Even my vulnerability was used as a weapon. Like, love me, damn it. Can't you see I'm hurt? See how sensitive and vulnerable I am? While I'm raging underneath and monitoring your anger to make sure I control you adequately. Things are not as they appear, is what I'm saying with sensitivity. And then one more thing about empathy and being empathic. I was just doing some research recently, perhaps in preparation for this, about what empathy is and words related to it. Because if I switch over to hurt and sadness repression here, empathy. Do you see how somebody who has to repress hurt and sadness might also have to repress love, sensitivity, and empathy? Excuse me, not apathy, empathy. Because all those things are too close to the vulnerable emotions. So that's where their sensitivity goes. It's not gone. It's just held back. So maybe it's held back in you. You don't show it, but it's there. So this podcast episode speaks to everybody on this topic. Those who are overtly more sensitive and those who are covertly more sensitive, the ones who have to hold the hurt and sadness back and the sensitivity. If you go in, you'll feel it too. And what am I talking about? See, there is this vulnerable side to us. I've always known it. It wasn't always safe to express it, of course, because of my anger repression and other things, but it's always been safer for me, this sort of vulnerable, sweet side. Like in an argument, if we get the vulnerability, it's so easy for me, unless I'm self-protecting under, from anger, and I just can't express it, and then I can't get the vulnerability. But if I get to anger, I can get to the sensitivity that matters, that is attuned to other people and not monitoring for safety. Those have been really rich conversations with people. And if you're a hurt or sadness repressor, find somebody who can see you but doesn't scare you when they see you. That could be the first way to really discover that you too have the very thing that you sometimes shadow out. Hurt and sadness repressors will sometimes look at somebody who's vulnerable and say, you're too sensitive. But if you look, hurt and sadness repressors, you have that in you. It may not feel safe, but that's how shadows work. That sensitivity or vulnerability that we all have is something that you bury, so you might look at us and say, we're too sensitive. But we're not. You have that. But if it doesn't feel safe, it doesn't feel safe. What I want to invite people into is some of you will come to work with me. I just have to mention this here because this is so much about safety on this topic. Well, always about the topic of repression. Safety and trust and feeling open, because I've had these really profoundly sweet exchanges with Chester where I've seen his vulnerability despite any exterior. And so I know that's there in you guys. You guys who have maybe been angry more than hurt in your life. Just come and sit with me if you're earnest and sit in a session first and bring up this topic of how you've always felt sensitive and you know that's a source of the suffering, not being able to open to that. And if you can feel safe with me, we will explore how that's connected, that sensitivity that you can't show, to the repression of hurt and sadness. And then to anger repressors, safety. Even though I've done anger repression work, I'm not angry. So you can feel safe with me. I can get angry, but that's usually if somebody comes at me, in a way that I feel is really unconscious, I can defend myself in. But mostly you can feel safe with me. But it's a kind of safety where we have to explore how your sensitivity is connected to your anger repression and your triggerability. So when you sit with me and work with me, all of you could potentially be triggered because of repression with me to protect yourself. But if you'll notice and not hold me to be a perfect person, but just to be myself, I want to show you how the sensitivity is a gift. I had trouble with that before this work, really owning that sensitivity is a gift, because it was such a burden for me, such a source of suffering. But once I've cleared the repression, it's completely different. And now I can talk about sensitivity as a gift. See, I think some people talk about it too early because they're trying to self-protect. They come to spirituality, I'm an empath, but that's self-protective because it's not who you are really. But when you do this work, I feel like now we can talk about sensitivity as a gift. It truly is. Without it, how could we be vulnerable? How could we really be open with each other? It's such a gift, and it's critically important in the awakening path, because we have to, as anger repressors, become sensitive to this buried anger. And that's a new kind of sensitivity that we've disconnected from. So we need to use our sensitivity towards this buried anger. It's so helpful. Hurt repressors use that sensitivity to connect with what's vulnerable. The sensitivity even in relationship, the triggers, all of it, it's all helpful. And the sensitivity itself is a gift to show you what you are. And I'll leave you with this. What you are, your authentic self, is sensitive, most likely. That's just one of the qualities of it, though. There are many qualities to what we really are, and you'll find them yourself. But there's power, because we can get angry. There's wisdom, because of the transformation. There's love, because of the embodiment, the wholeness of allowing all emotions. There's vulnerability, because we can open to those emotions, and we don't have to hold anger back, for example, because that's a part of it, not being vulnerable. It's not being able to be angry. There's the quality of compassion, which often is associated with sensitivity. If I can be sensitive to what you're going through, I can experience compassion. But with anger, for example, repression, the compassion is driven by the need to control and stay safe. So the sensitivity gets turned towards the repression so that the fear behind that compassion can dissolve and real compassion can come forth as a quality of what you are. You're just things like creativity. Our sensitivity, when we're growing up, it makes creativity almost like a necessity. We have to have this outlet because we can't be ourselves. But what if creativity it's no longer an outlet on the side? Your whole life is a creative process. That's what I'm talking about. Is when this sensitivity is really seen for the gift that it is. Thomas Hübl says that trauma are frozen emotions. That's our unrealized potential. That's exactly what I'm talking about. We have to use our sensitivity in the name of self-protection until we clear repression. Then the sensitivity comes online to help us discover our unrealized potential, which just means transmute that frozen fear and be your authentic self. And everything that includes, all the openness that you'll have, because you're no longer monitoring other people to stay safe. You're just being yourself. If you're interested, this went on a little bit longer than I thought, but hopefully it's helpful. You can go to repressiontest.com. There you take our test and you see what emotions that you bury, get on our newsletter, and learn about our resources. Also, I'm going to put links, as always, in the description here. If you click on one of those links, it takes you right to a resource where you can start the work. Thank you.